Good morning, everyone. So this is a short excerpt from the second half of Smurf in Wanderland, so hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense. Okay, so as a lifetime resident of the Greater West, it made sense to my dad to hate the North Shore. Not the people who lived on the North Shore, just the idea of the North Shore, what the North Shore represented: power, affluence, undeserved privilege. A hatred of the North Shore was a worldview that my dad could empathise with. To be fair to my dad, it's a pretty passive hatred. It's more of a mild resentment. I've inherited a bit of that, though I acknowledge that it's a totally illogical worldview. I mean, my relationship with the north side of Sydney is pretty much zero, so why should I care about them enough to resent them? And yet, at particular moments, this sense of them negatively affecting the daily lives of us feels palpable. This resentment has a truthiness, to use Stephen Colbert's term, a sense of feeling true, whether or not it actually is true. And the truthiness of this sense of division drives the passion of football fans. My team is better, stronger, more exciting, more deserving, and more hard done by than yours. Not for very many objectively measurable reasons, but rather because I passionately believe this to be true, because it feels true. My team, even when I hate it, has to be better than yours because it's my team. At the Sydney FC Member Forum in March 2016, Sydney FC's chairman Scott Barlow declared, "We are a team for all of Sydney, with our heartland in Sydney's north, south, east, and inner west." That's something that only someone who's not actually from Sydney could ever say with a straight face. In the 40 plus years that I've lived in Sydney, I've found that the areas that Scott Barlow mentions have very little in common. But in terms of membership metrics, he's correct. Sydney FC's members are geographically spread all over Sydney. Very few of them, only 9% in 2016, live in the eastern suburbs. And so the east-west divide between Sydney FC and the Western Sydney Wanderers doesn't really make any sense. But the east-west divide feels true. It has a truthiness. But the idea that all of Sydney is the same, that the 5-odd million people who live here have the same or even similar interests, outlooks, hopes, aspirations and dreams is pretty questionable. Sydney is a city shaped by disconnections, by distastes and sometimes outright hostilities to those other parts of the greater city, those parts of the city most alien to people like us, whatever us might be. So, how can a football club belong to everyone in Sydney? Well, it can't. And this has always been the problem faced by Sydney FC. Declaring that you are a football club for all of Sydney does not actually make you a football club for all of Sydney, no matter how much you might desperately want this to be true. As a Wanderers member in season 9 of the A-League, so that's from October 2013 to May 2014, I received a lot of emails from the club's communication team once or twice a week. And one thing that I noticed about these emails is they didn't talk much about who the club is, but instead focused more on what the club does. So unlike Sydney FC, the Western Sydney Wanderers didn't seem to obsess about identity. It's pretty easy to understand why. The Western Sydney Wanderers are from somewhere. As much as Western Sydney is a huge and hugely mixed up collection of suburbs, they share a sense that they're doing it tough, that the rest of Sydney doesn't really care about them and hasn't given them their fair share. There's plenty of justification for this view. Just look at the disparity in expenditure on public infrastructure between the inner city and the Greater West. As someone who lived in Western Sydney for over 20 years, I can well understand this sense of being ignored, of not being listened to, of not being taken seriously, of being an outsider. These insecurities, both real and imagined, have fundamentally shaped my lived experience of this city. Greystanes, where I grew up, has very little in common with Fairfield and Blacktown and Penrith and Campbelltown and Parramatta and Wentworthville and Granville and Auburn and Marylands and Guildford and Eunora and Harris Park and Liverpool and all of the other suburbs, too numerous to mention. Each of these suburbs has their distinct communities, their histories, their opportunities, their challenges, their identities. But the only time any of these suburbs get any attention is when something goes terribly wrong or when there's an election. The formation of the Western Sydney Wanderers gave all of these suburbs a shared something to feel proud of, something that they could all belong to. Part of me wishes that they could have existed at a time when they could have been my team, and I could have stood in the stadium holding a sign with my old postcode on it, 2145. At the first Sydney derby that was played at Sydney FC's home stadium, at Allianz Stadium in Moore Park, in December 2012, hundreds of Wanderers members stood in the stadium stands holding signs with their old postcodes on them, as if to say, look at where we've come from. You can't ignore us now. You can't ignore us anymore. As if to say, we're all here. See us, listen to us, treat our hopes and dreams and aspirations seriously. Stop mocking us, stop belittling us, stop pretending that we don't matter, stop pretending that we don't exist, stop pretending that we don't exist. We're here. We're proud of where we've come from. We're passionate. We're together. And together we have power. As a young member of the RBB, the Red and the Black Bloc, the Western Sydney Wanderers active supporter group, once said to me, it's not about the competition. It's about showing that we're here, that Western Sydney is in your face. Thank you and good day.